Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Hasten, correspondent for JNS. Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS, he is up on the screen. He's halfway around the world, all the way in Las Vegas, wrapping up the Republican Jewish Coalition. Good to see you out there, Alex.
Good to be here, Josh. Thank you.
What can you tell us about the festivities over there at the RJC? What do you think was the highlight from the week? What's the top story coming out of Las Vegas?
Sure. Well, there was about 2.5 days worth of nonstop addresses by Republican candidates for office, including a salad address from President Trump and several others, congressmen, senators. And what seemed clear was that to the Republican Party, supporting Israel is a major tenet of the party's policy. That was the overriding message. You just heard the word Israel being spoken. Just every other sentence was about Israel. And so I think that people in the Republican Party can be certain that their elected representatives want to support the state of Israel. That there's really little dissent there in that position. JNS, we got a lot done over there. We had an award with Mark Levin. You can interview with Mark on JNS TV. We also, I performed a war briefing on the last session of the conference, attended by over 350 people with extensive Q&A. So JNS got a warm reception from the RJC audience.
Sounds great. I'll be honest with you. I have FOMO here. I try not to leave Israel, but I would have liked to attend it. I got a little FOMO, but maybe next year I'll go check out the RJC. That being said, you mentioned the support for Israel by President Donald Trump and most of the speakers, if not all of the speakers there at the RJC. At the same time, you had a little bit of controversy here with Democratic vice presidential nominee Tim Walz in a radio interview on Thursday. He said that anti-Israel protesters are, quote, speaking out for all the right reasons, and that more pressure should be applied to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to accept a Palestinian state. He also did not mention the word Hamas in his address. He said he supported Israel, but didn't even mention Hamas by name. What can we make of these statements for the vice presidential hopeful there?
Well, I think it's just the contradiction between the Republican Party is talking about Israel, is talking about Hamas and the Palestinians, Palestinian state versus the way Democrats are talking about. On the one hand, Democrats certainly are going to great effort to say that they do support the state of Israel, but they seem to be hedging between support for Israel and support for pro-Palestinian protesters across the United States. No sympathy for pro-Palestinian protesters in the Republican Party right now. They do understand that Hamas is a terrorist organization. They said it over and over again, and those that support Hamas, they believe, don't support America. And so you see the very different two parties and how their state of Israel.
Alex, at the same time, you had Walz at the Minnesota State Fair last Sunday being pressed by a journalist. If he could comment on the deaths of the 6 hostages murdered by Hamas in Gaza, and he essentially ignored the question, and some argue maybe he didn't hear it or whatnot, but I think it was crystal clear, and he decided to ignore. He did not want to comment on the fact that 6 people were murdered by Hamas, including an American citizen. What can we make of that?
Well, you always want to make sure that the candidate heard the question, that you're not putting words or projecting into a candidate's mouth. But the death of the hostages should have been the perfect opportunity for Walz and the Democrats to come out strongly against Hamas once again in this moment when they demonstrated the barbarism and the same barbarism that they used on October 7th here, killing 6 hostages in cold blood, just as the state of Israel was simultaneously trying to release them as well as negotiating toward their release, and specifically with an American killed there. But unfortunately, I think it's a missed opportunity. And instead of coming out and recognizing and putting more pressure on Hamas, as Netanyahu has been saying, the more pressure you put on Hamas, the more likely you are to get a hostage resolution deal. They're putting more pressure on Netanyahu to accept whatever terms Hamas is putting out there. You're basically encouraging Hamas to continue to reset the dial with regards to more and more terms. There's a reason why they don't want Israel to maintain the Philadelphi Accord, or there's a reason why they want Israel to stop the war. And unfortunately, the Biden administration, and at this point, Tim Walz is included in that as the vice presidential candidate, that they want Israel to give in, and they don't seem to want Hamas to be removed as a political or a military power in Gaza.
At the same time, following the deaths of those 6 hostages last week, the U.S. Department of Justice announced terrorism charges against senior leaders of Hamas for carrying out the October 7th massacre. Let's take a look at the video clip.
Today, the Justice Department unsealed charges against Yahya Sinwar and other senior leaders of Hamas for financing and directing a decades-long campaign to murder American citizens and endanger the security of the United States. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists murdered nearly 1,200 people, including over 40 Americans, and kidnapped hundreds of civilians. They perpetrated the deadliest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. This weekend, we learned that Hamas murdered 6 more hostages, including Hersh Goldberg Poland, a 23-year-old Israeli American. We are investigating Hersh's murder and each and every one of the brutal murders of Americans as acts of terrorism.
Now, let's be clear here. The announcement now, this is not a new investigation. This is something that happened months and months ago, about 7 months ago. But according to Eugene Kontorovich, he's a professional, he's an international law expert. Apparently now that information has been unsealed. And to make it look like essentially the Biden administration is doing something in response to the killing of Hersh Goldberg Poland, the American citizen. But again, this is something from 6 months ago. Some of us didn't know about it, and it came out just now. And people are accusing the Biden administration of, I guess, seizing this opportunity to finally appear as if they're taking a stance against Hamas.
Well, I don't know that the unsealing of the information now is extremely symbolic. I don't know if it's meant to cover something up. I would never go necessarily to that extreme, but certainly Hamas is a terror organization. So this designation is correct. The question is, what's going to happen as a result of the designation? Is the United States going to put more pressure on foreign entities not to send money into Gaza? Are they going to condition rebuilding aid after this war is over, on making sure that Hamas can't get their hands on that money, that they're not part of the equation? So, just the unsealing of this investigation, I don't think is overall that significant. The question is, what's going to happen as a result of the designation?
At the same time, Hamas and other terror organizations perhaps trying to carry out another October 7th. I have no doubt that that's what they would like to do. And in fact, an Arab terror squad based in Jenin, and we've had troops in Jenin over the last several weeks. They were just pulled out, IDF troops. According to this report, a terror squad in Jenin planned to infiltrate Israeli communities in Samaria and carry out an October 7th style massacre, according to an indictment published by Channel 14 on Wednesday. So again, we had the horrible murder of 1,200 Israeli civilians and soldiers on October 7th, and it looks like they're trying to repeat it again in other areas. And thank God, in this case, this plan was foiled. This terror squad was brought in and arrested.
Well, within the first weeks of the war, we definitely saw an increase in terror inside Jerusalem at some of the crossing. There was a shooting at the Ma'ale Adumim crossing. There was a shooting at the Gush Etzion tunnels crossing. But then it seemed that there was a bit of a lull. I mean, there were definitely isolated terror attacks, that were happening over the last months, but you didn't really see a major increase in terror in this region. But we're seeing in the last several weeks that Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and even Fatah terror cells are trying to take the battle from Gaza and extend it into Judea and Samaria. The IDF's been very active. We talked last week about the major operations in Tulkarm and Jenin and Farah. And I think that the IDF's going to continue to be active to make sure that this doesn't spill out into full-fledged conflict in Judea and Samaria, Jerusalem, and other mixed Arab-Israeli cities.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing a spike in Judea and Samaria. We'll have to see how that plays out. At the same time, last night in Tel Aviv, you had several 100,000 people rallying, encouraging Israel, the prime minister, to come to some sort of deal to release the hostages, which would involve the release of Arab terrorists, some of them hardened Arab terrorists with blood on their hands. And according to a report, Jerusalem might consider a withdrawal of troops from the Egypt-Gaza border as part of the hostage deal with Hamas if a viable alternative can be found to prevent Hamas from rearming itself through those tunnels from Egypt. Let's jump out to the video. Prime Minister Netanyahu commenting on the Philadelphia corridor.
Mr. Prime Minister, Antony Blinken said he heard directly from you that you had endorsed a clear schedule and locations for the withdrawal of troops. Did you tell him that you would withdraw troops from the Philadelphia corridor at any point in a deal?
No, I said I think you're conflating here two things. Number one, I agreed to reduce the number of troops along the Philadelphia corridor, okay? Because we don't need a division and a half on this 8-mile corridor. We don't need that. And the conditions that we shall have for a permanent ceasefire must include a situation where the Philadelphia corridor cannot be perforated. Somebody has to be there. Somebody has to be there. Look, I don't care. Bring me anyone who will actually show us, not on paper, not in words, not in a slide, but on the ground, day after day, week after week, month after month, that they can actually prevent the recurrence of what happened there before. We're open to consider it.
So, again, to be clear here, we've been saying for weeks, and the Prime Minister has made it clear, that Israel must maintain a security presence on the Philadelphia corridor, that is that strategic strip of land between Gaza and Egypt. And now we're seeing perhaps some flexibility from the Prime Minister. Maybe it's pressure from the fact that you have hundreds of thousands of people protesting, maybe a policy shift. I mean, what's your take on the fact that perhaps Netanyahu is actually considering some sort of easing his what seemed like an absolute red line in terms of an Israeli presence on the Philadelphia corridor? I'm not talking about a full withdrawal of troops, but some sort of partial, maybe symbolic gesture in order to get to some kind of deal in regard to the hostages.
Well, on the one hand, I don't see Israel leaving the Philadelphia corridor anytime soon. At the same time, Netanyahu definitely wants to demonstrate to all parties involved, not just Hamas, also to the Americans, also to Israelis, also to the families of the hostages that are protesting out in the streets, as you mentioned, that there is some degree of flexibility, that Netanyahu can ebb and flow with whatever's being proposed on the table. But he's talking about potentially reducing the IDF presence. We don't know exactly what that meant. We don't know how many troops the IDF wanted to keep in the Philadelphia corridor to begin with, or how many that they need to be there. So it could be that there's talking about a slight reduction. And then talking about leaving, well, that's also dependent on Hamas delivering. And so far, we've seen no indication of Hamas delivering. And I think that's part of Netanyahu's style, is to hedge, to say, okay, look, if Hamas, if you're going to leave the Gaza Strip, if you're going to give us back the hostages, if we have other guarantees that weapons are not going to flow from Egypt into Gaza, then we would consider leaving the Philadelphia corridor. But it's a trust but verify system. So on the one hand, express some flexibility to be willing to give in. On the other hand, not giving in unless you're sure that Israeli security is not being diminished.
And if we didn't need more proof that Hamas can't be trusted, a newly revealed Hamas document indicates the terror group's main concern in the ceasefire negotiations with Israel is to rehabilitate its military capabilities and not to alleviate the suffering of Gaza's civilian population, according to the German newspaper Bild report on Friday. So we see, according to this report, Hamas taking advantage of the ceasefire negotiations, taking advantage of the opportunity in order to further its military capabilities, and certainly doesn't have Israeli citizens concerned for them, and doesn't have concern for their own citizens, their own so-called civilians.
Well, Hamas has been on the offensive the entire time, and Israel's been forced to react. And so Hamas can pivot, and Israel's forced to react. Israel's not on the offensive here. And so you're starting to see from these documents that have been found, we're not 100% certain as to the authenticity of the documents. We can believe them to be, as they are reported, as authentic. But you see about the psychological terror that Hamas wants to use here. You see about the diplomatic pressure that they're trying to put on Israel to rebuild the military capabilities. And we've seen that the Hamas is the first ones to put their hands on humanitarian aid. How do you think that the the terrorists in the tunnels, including Yahya Sinwar, have been able to survive for so long. Obviously, whatever aid's coming to Gaza is reaching Hamas and the terrorists. That is the very reason why they are completely unwilling to release hostages if Israel's going to maintain a presence on the Philadelphia corridor. And all these things are connected. Hamas is not willing to back away from power in the Gaza Strip. They think that they're going to be able to wave the flag of victory, and for them, a victory is just remain standing at the end. Unfortunately, the United States and others, the Biden administration and others, are trying to allow Hamas to remain standing. It's going to be up to Israel to make sure that Hamas is no longer a political or military power in the Gaza Strip.
And on cue, you would think after the October 7th massacre that the world would see the difference between good and bad, evil, which is Hamas, and the democratic state of Israel. But that being said, the United Kingdom is suspending arms sales to Israel. Some arms sales, let's be clear here, did the IDF announce this week. The UK claiming there is a clear risk the weapons would be used by the Jewish state's military to, quote, commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. Let's take a look at a video here of the UK Foreign Secretary.
It is with regret that I inform the House today the assessment I have received leaves me unable to conclude anything other than that for certain UK arms exports to Israel, there does exist a clear risk that might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. I have informed my right honourable friend, the Business and Trade Secretary, and he is therefore today announcing the suspension of around 30 from a total of approximately 350 to Israel as required under the Export Controls Act.
So there you have it. Prime Minister Netanyahu calling the British government's partial suspension of arms sales to Israel a shameful decision that won't stop the Jewish state's determination to defeat Hamas. So we've had this conversation before in terms of threatening from the Biden administration and others threatening arms sales to Israel. It looks like the UK is going forward and suspending some arms sales to Israel at this juncture, perhaps when we need their help the most. The Prime Minister absolutely upset with the UK government.
Well, the Prime Minister saying that Israel will continue to fight regardless, and I've heard the Prime Minister and the Minister Dermer, a member of the War Cabinet, say that Israel will fight with its fingernails if that's what they have to do. And if you look at the bravery and the courage of Israel's soldiers, I believe it. They'll continue to do what they need to do, even if the UK doesn't provide weapons. But what a signal that one of the countries that's supposed to be one of Israel's closest allies, the UK, is sending to Hamas right now that they're willing to put the pressure on the state of Israel and to not give Israel the weapons that they need. Fortunately, the UK is not one of Israel's largest suppliers. That's the United States. But a little bit of foretelling of what could happen in the future. Right now, it's the UK. This is like a bellwether test. The UK already saying that they will suspend some weapons. I think that Israel could expect that more weapons will be halted to Israel, not only from the UK, but from other suppliers, specifically those in Europe and potentially even from the United States. So we're starting to see, sanctions, the withholding of weapons. These are all the types of tools that are going to be used against Israel at some point, even regardless of whether Israel strikes a strong victory. And it's not clear that a Harris-Walz administration would stand up against that. I think a better indication that I saw, at least at RJC this week, that if the Trump administration came in, specifically backed by a Republican majority Congress or Senate, that you would see very strong pushing back against the halting of arms sales and any kind of sanctions against the state of Israel.
Turning our attention to the north, this morning I had my alarm set for 6:45 a.m., yet at 6 o'clock, Hezbollah had other plans because I have the Code Red app on my phone and it started going crazy. Once again, just in the last several hours alone, more than 50 rockets launched from Lebanon at the Galilee Panhandle and the community of the town of Kiryat Shmona and the surrounding areas. And it was going on off, over Shabbat. It was going off the red alert. And it has not stopped since October the 8th. Hezbollah continued to fire rockets. That being said, we have not yet seen other than that one day where Israel took preemptive strike and took out Hezbollah rockets as they were going to be aimed targeting Tel Aviv and other sensitive intelligence headquarters of the IDF, which Israel thwarted since then, which was about 2 weeks ago. And again, not to downplay the fact they continue to fire these rockets at us, we haven't seen that major Hezbollah response to the fact that Israel killed a senior Hezbollah official. We also haven't seen Iran, as they've threatened to do, strike Israel after the death of the Hamas leader, rather, in Tehran. I think it's been about a month now, Hania. So what can we see from the fact that we haven't seen any type of major response, even though they're threatening to do so, both Hezbollah and both the Iranians?
Well, if you go back to the incident 2 weeks ago where Hezbollah was preparing to retaliate for the killing of Shukr, the number 2 of Hezbollah, when Israel took him out about a month ago in Beirut in an airstrike, Hezbollah said they were going to respond. Israel was tracking very closely the movements. When they determined that Hezbollah was right about ready to send a major volley of missiles and rockets, Israel preempted that action, taking out over 1,000 targets with 100 planes in a period of about an hour. And it looked like Israel did succeed to not only to block at least 60% of what Hezbollah was planning to fire, but also, more importantly, in establishing some sort of deterrence that seemed to be lacking. Right. So Hezbollah right now, they recognize that if they'll fire massive volleys at Israel, that the patience is running thin with Netanyahu and the IDF, and that it would be likely that the response would be very strong. So now Hezbollah is back to the strategy that they were doing early in the war, which is testing to see just how much they can get away with. Right. So, they went from a major potential attack, which was foiled by the Air Force, to, now going back to the small localized rockets. And now you're starting to see how the attacks are increasing incrementally. And the question will be, what will the IDF's response look like? It looks like, from what we can see, that the IDF is being much more efficient and targeted, filing down Hezbollah's capabilities. And it's a slow go because Hezbollah has a lot of capabilities. Israel's only operating from the air so far, from, let's say, 95% from the air. There's been maybe some cross-border raids that are not being talked about too much. But this front is very serious, and it's still very hot, and Israel still has to be able to figure out a way to return 80,000 of its citizens that have been evacuated from their homes back. So, I do see the possibilities of continued escalations on the northern front, even though it looks like we've been for the last few weeks in a bit of a lull.
Yeah, we're still on high alert here in Israel. That being said, other than the northern border and situation down in Gaza, it's business as usual in places like Jerusalem and whatnot. You wouldn't know that there is this threat looming over our heads. But again, we are still on high alert, anticipating it at any time. Yeah.
And you also mentioned Iran.
Yes.
And I think it's important to note that it does appear that Iran is somewhat deterred. They had insisted that they were going to respond for the killing of Ismail Haniyeh on their territory when he was visiting Tehran for the inauguration of the new Iranian president, Pezeshkian, and it was expected, that they were going to fire some kind of massive retaliation, even potentially on Tisha B'Av. Everybody was waiting for that, almost a month ago, and that attack hasn't come. And so I think you have to recognize that there's some sort of deterrence here. You don't know if that's only Israel and what it has been able to do, or what messages it might be sending diplomatically through third-party channels or through the United States, or what the United States is telling Iran. But for whatever reason, Iran has decided, up until now at least, not to retaliate. And so that could potentially be a victory for Israel.
Turning now to Europe, and again, I don't know if it was determined, in fact, who was behind this potential attack, if Iran had something to do with it, and I'm referring to a shooting at the Israeli consulate in Munich on the anniversary of the Munich Olympics massacre back in 1972. You had a gunman opening fire at the Israeli consulate in Munich. German security personnel shot the aggressor during an exchange of fire. The suspect died at the scene. No other injuries reported. The consulate was closed. It was already closed in commemoration of the massacre, so not too many people probably in that building. That being said, Not by chance that this gunman, I would say, picked the date, the day of the massacre from 1972 in order to try to carry out a shooting at an Israeli consulate there in Munich.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember the Munich massacre. The Israeli Olympic team went to Germany. They were massacred there by Palestinian terrorists. The Palestinians have been pulling off terror for decades, right? This was in the 70s, Munich massacre. We remember all the hijackings. This is Palestinians' main industry, which is exporting terror. They haven't really exported much else except for terrorism, and they just changed their tactics. You heard just a couple weeks ago the call for renewed suicide bombers, to attack, and then we saw the double car bombings that took place last week in the gas station near Efrat, and also in what was it, Karmei Tzur. Right, and so this is plane hijackings, attacking athletes, attacking embassies. As we've seen, these are all of the methodologies used by terrorists. And unfortunately, Iran and the Palestinians have been exporting terror for many years.
So you had the foiled October 7th style massacre, thank God, in Samaria. You had a shooting at the Israeli consulate in Munich. And now reports indicate that a Pakistani national was going to try to carry out also an October 7th style massacre against Jews in New York. A 22-year-old Pakistani tried to travel from Canada to New York City, where he intended to use automatic and semi-automatic weapons to carry out a mass shooting at a Jewish center, perhaps a Chabad center in Brooklyn, New York. All sorts of ISIS-related materials on his social media, and also distributed to some of his followers and supporters or whatnot. The guy was pledging allegiance to ISIS, and he also wanted to jump on the terrorism ship, I guess, and carry out a massacre in New York on the anniversary of the 2023 massacre here in Israel.
Certainly things getting more dangerous for Jews across North America. I was here for Shabbat in Las Vegas, in the local Las Vegas Jewish community, which is it's half an hour off of the main strip. You have to have armed security in front of every synagogue. On Shabbat, certainly every synagogue, every Jewish community center right now is a potential target. And you don't know where that can come from, whether that's going to come from some kind of like a crazy right-wing fanatic, or whether that's going to come from some kind of Pakistani or other anti-Israel Muslim or whoever. It could come from any side right now, and Jews in America have to be on very high alert.
Jews in America have to be on high alert, and our leadership here in Israel has to be concerned over the fact, somehow, even though we were attacked on October the 7th, that these international bodies perhaps want to see the arrest of some of our leadership, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, the Attorney General, Gali Barhav Meira. She has warned Netanyahu that a state commission of inquiry into the events leading up to the ongoing war in Gaza and how that campaign has been handled is the best way to prevent arrest warrants being issued against senior Israeli civilian and military officials. So we've said for a long time now, eventually, at the end of the day, there will be some sort of inquiry commission, an official commission as to the failures of October the 7th. And it is her opinion that this must happen, and it must happen sooner rather than later, perhaps in order to prevent the arrest of our senior leadership. They can get on a plane to somewhere and be arrested at an airport, somewhere around the world, where they are falling into this trap of blaming the Israeli government instead of the focus on those who carried out the October 7th massacre. What is your thoughts on the Attorney General's recommendation here?
Well, I have mixed thoughts here. I mean, I think that the argument is disingenuous. The argument that the only way to prevent international arrest warrants is to have a commission of inquiry. I mean, I don't understand what a commission of inquiry has anything to do with whether the international community is going to issue arrest warrants. They're going to look at what Israel's done in Gaza, independently, and they're going to decide. And probably, I wouldn't be surprised if the international community does issue arrest warrants, not because Israel committed war crimes, but because the international community wants to issue arrest warrants, the same way that the that the international community, International Court of Justice, is trying Israel for genocide when it's obvious that Israel's not committing anything near what the term genocide means. So the International Criminal Court, it could very well likely issue arrest warrants, but then a commission of inquiry has very little to do with that. What the commission of inquiry does have to do with, I think, from the Attorney General's point of view, is to place significant blame for the October 7th attack on Benjamin Netanyahu. And she's hoping that by having the commission of inquiry, having it get finished as soon as possible, that then the Israeli public will turn on their prime minister. That's what the hope is. Now, at the same time, I would say that I think it's extremely important for there to be a commission of inquiry, because I think that the security failures go much deeper than the prime minister. And if the prime minister is responsible, the buck should stop with the prime minister. I have no problem with that. But the failing, the security failing, the intelligence failing, the conceptual failings, are much deeper than the responsibility of just the prime minister. I think that that's all going to come out in a commission of inquiry. At the same time, we're coming up now on 11 months. We're exactly 11 months since the October 7th attack, and you don't want too much more time to go by before you start this commission of inquiry. You have to do the commission of inquiry when what happened on October 7th is still fresh in people's minds, when the people that were responsible are still working in their positions. At a certain point, I understand that the war is taking longer, and I think that all Israelis should be understanding that you can't fight these terrorists in the same way that you fought state armies, and there's no 6-day wars anymore. And that Hamas's strategy, Hezbollah's strategy, Iran's strategy is to get Israel into a war of attrition. Israel has no choice but to fight slowly, methodically, effectively, especially if they want to reduce the civilian casualties. But that doesn't mean that the commission of inquiry should go on for however, it should not be launched until this whatever this war of attrition is finished. The commission of inquiry should happen. Everybody needs to understand who was at fault on October 7th and beforehand.
Yeah, that certainly will happen, and we'll see how long the war takes. We'll see as Israel does make great progress in Gaza to take out Hamas, and we'll have to deal with the Northern Front and Iran as well. Alex, before we let you go, what's on your itinerary for the rest of the week here for JNS News as you're over there in the United States?
Yeah, well, I'll be flying tomorrow to California. I'll be there for a few days on some meetings. I just spoke here over Sabbath and the Young Israel as the scholar in residence. Then I'll be going to Boston. I'll be going from there to New York, and then I'll be ending up in 2 weeks at the Israeli American Council, a major conference. Should be about 4,000 people in Washington, D.C., mostly Israelis who are living in the United States, but certainly some other major Israeli politicians and American politicians from both parties, in the run-up to the 2024 election, and lots of good Jewish organizations there as well.
Well, good luck to you on your travels, and we will catch up with you on screen once again next week. Much success to you, Alex, over there in the U.S.
Thanks for holding the fort, Josh.
My pleasure. And big shout out to Ryan Lifshitz for everything he does behind the scenes here at JNS News. Make sure you continue to follow all the programming on JNS TV on YouTube, and go to jns.org for all the latest news coverage from Israel and the Jewish world. Have a wonderful week, everybody. Be safe out there. Continue to pray for the brave men and women of the IDF for protecting us 24/7. Have a great week, everyone.